Chapter 4. It was shortly after the announcement that my mother would be returning from her trip that had previously afforded me the privacy I needed to deal with these otherworldly intruders that I was suddenly stricken with the necessity to conceal the two of them from others. I had been lucky to this point, as they had taken steps to blend themselves within society at school, no doubt made easy by their fascination with our culture. But this was another matter. Surely my mother would find it unreasonable for two girls my age to be living in our home, and she would see the error in their insistence on using our family name and claiming part of our lineage. She would find that suspicious, and there was no way for me to explain their true origins and reasons for arrival, as these were things I could not expect any normal person to believe, things I knew I couldn't understand for myself, and things that I wished were simply not true. My attempts to hastily evict the squatters were fruitless, as they merely invited themselves back in with little trouble. All I could think to do was clean up the evidence of their extended stay as much as possible, their experiments with human food on the table, the assortment of random items and games on the floor, and most importantly, the rank collection of meat whose origins I had never dared inquire about that piled up in the refrigerator, and wished that the beings would manage to cover up their presence like they had somewhat successfully done at school. Whether they understood the situation or not I could not say, as their behavior at this time was as whimsically mocking as ever, exhibiting their usual jokes and flirtatiousness for myself and each other, and before I could explain the situation proper, I found my mother at the door, staring down the ash of God and the great old one with a confused look. Shortly after her arrival, my mother took to the living room to await an explanation. As we sat across from her, I began to search for words, any words that would form a believable excuse to these events, a tale that would convince my mother of normal circumstances when there clearly were none in this invaded house. Before I found these words, however, it was the thing in the form of a silver-haired girl that spoke first, and said the words that I feared the most, the awful, terrible description of what passed as the truth of the days that had passed since its arrival. It plainly stated its true name, its outer space origins, its membership to a cosmic police organization that aimed to protect me, and worse, its bizarre desire to combine our species. Why that malignant deity would choose to divulge all this information to a normal human, why it thought my mother could handle such a story, I shuddered in fear to think about. But, even more startling, even more frightful, was my mother's reaction, for it was not one of disbelief, but of immediate understanding and resistance to these powerful things. I must admit that I could not grasp onto every word my mother offered to me and the two visitors in the explanation later that night. It was a dizzying revelation that I did not want to believe, but as the events of these days had shown me, there were far too many things in this universe and perhaps beyond that exceeded my capability to understand. My mother had claimed to be a deity hunter, having had studied under a college professor who had written a book on the subject and invited her along on certain expeditions. Yes, my father was aware of her actions and had approved of them. No, despite having the ties of a deity hunter, my mother's so-called part-time job was not dangerous. And yes, my father had not returned with her but will be spending more time at the office to make up for their vacation. She turned to the two others at the table, comically arguing over something we had heard in my mother's story, and boldly stated that while she would allow them to stay, she would not approve of a relationship between a human and something else. I retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of preparing dinner for the four of us, but relished the effort it took to make a normal decision such as what to cook as opposed to mulling over the conversations from earlier. Though the reality of the situation always presented itself to me, whether plainly with the attacks by night gaunts and other creatures, or the horrible trip to that long-dead city, or through the more subtle, inexplicable otherworldly feeling from the silver-haired thing, the uneasiness or oppressiveness or sheer pull of gravity one felt just by being in the same room. A small hope existed in the back of my mind that there was some other explanation to all the events, perhaps some nearly impossible combination of pranks, delusions, vivid dreams, or some other events. Instead, the understanding, acceptance, and control over the situation shown by my mother was a reaction I could not have expected. This confusing discovery was, unfortunately, the only true explanation for a maddening event that I found myself in at the time, standing in my kitchen with the calculating Nyarlathotep, again playing the role of a young girl with the aspirations of marriage and all that came with it, dismissing a foul, unusually offensive package that it claimed to contain the meat of the black goat of the woods with 1,000 yen itself. The following night and morning are of particular interest as they were somewhat unlike the days that had come before. Though I still quite had not come to terms with the story my mother presented me the night before, I had noted that there were certain consistencies that immediately presented themselves to me. The first being the night I had spent in bed, an eventless, restful sleep that I had not experienced in quite some time. Since the arrival of my original companion, nights were marked with scratching noises emanating from the walls, chorus of whispers inside my head, and terrible dreams filled with queer lights and odd shapes. But on that night these things were not there and permitted the first restful sleep I had enjoyed since then. The second was the respect my mother commanded from the two beings, and while it is possible they truly felt concern from the supposed deity hunter, I could not help but note the usual mocking, ball-playing antics the two things displayed, and feared that they were merely playing another part and could deal with something that was just a human. Whatever the reason, I enjoyed the opportunity to walk to school alone after my mother had chased the two things out of the house on their own. Almost each day during these times presented me with some new, strange thing to torment me in some way, and this day would prove to be no different. Before I could enjoy a leisurely stroll, without that clingy ferror hanging on my arm or the titanic presence of the living flame, I bumped into a young child walking in the opposite direction. My first impression of the child was yellow, as long, bright blonde hair met an equally bright yellow sweater and pair of shorts. The child's face and hair were girl-like, but its attire boyish, and neither its features nor voice discerned its gender. But the harm I had inflicted to it, coupled with a gentle breeze in the air, caused me no alarm, so I helped the child off his or her feet and asked if he or she was unharmed. And no, of course I was not hurt. I did not even fall, so there was no cause for concern. And so I saw the child off, and with a bright smile I was thanked and bid farewell to the suddenness of the event, causing me to pay no heed to the slight tug of doubt in my mind. Finally at school, with the room currently empty of visitors to this planet, I sat down at my desk to immediately rest my head upon it and close my eyes. The revelation of my mother's work as a deity hunter weighed heavily upon it if I paid it too much attention. Could my mother really be capable of fighting deities like the ones that had arrived? They were beings of power far beyond human understanding, something that I felt I knew due to those dream-time visits to that twilight void. Surely something that could stand on an equal plane with those things could not be a human. It was just days prior that I had encountered a hunter of deities in Nodens, though at the time his target was me and not a deity, and his mere presence was enough to tell that the elder god was certainly inhuman. The account I recalled of a young man who encountered Innsmouth concerned me greatly, for he was later able to trace his roots to the forsaken place in the lineage of the deep ones that had run through it. At this point, I was unsure of whether I could trust even the humanity in my own blood, but to give in to this fear would surely result in a complete breakdown of my mind and sanity. It was later after school that I again managed to evade the accompaniment of the outer god and the great old one, and again tried to enjoy a leisurely stroll home. This walk too was interrupted by a similar event as the one from this morning. Walking while lost in thought found me watching a young child bathed in yellow trip and fall to the ground. Again I helped the lad up, again questioning its gender, and again met with a smile and thanks and a gentle breeze. The child seemed to be looking for some place, clutching onto a set of directions, but if it was still walking around the town after all this time, then it certainly was having trouble finding its destination. Though I could not place why I was drawn to the young boy or girl, I found myself inviting him or her to a local restaurant for a late luncheon in explanation of its arrival to the quiet town. Surely the familiar feeling in my mind was just stress from the events I had experienced over the past few days. And even when that calculating, crawling chaos entered the restaurant with the fiery elemental in tow, I merely dismissed it as bad luck, or more likely my protector's stalking efforts. Again, however, I was betrayed. For as the two beings walked over to me and the child, falling into their usual chatter, looked upon the child with recognition. The boy, confirmed to be a being of male gender by my companion, was not the innocent child I had wished it to be, but another visitor to this planet for some reason. Perhaps blinded by the bright yellow I perceived when I looked at its form, perhaps misguided by the confusing question of its gender, or maybe lulled into security by the gentle breeze that had seemed to greet me each time I helped him off the ground, I again gave in to the welcome sense of a normal or only to find myself in the oppressive presence of another thing that hailed from some other world or some other plane or some other universe. The young child was actually Haster, the king in yellow, the great old one with an affinity for wind, a being whose name was only suitable to whispers in the darkness for the hideousness and fear it conjured. As I steeled myself yet again to the arrival of something else that should not exist, something else that no human should encounter. Nyarlathotep and Sithugio began leisurely recalling nostalgic times with Haisto, catching up on lost time, and comparing their reasons for being on this planet. Had I listened to this conversation in full, had I contemplated how such monsters could act so casually when the world around me was a writhing, breathing, living abomination, maybe that would have been the breaking point I so struggled to avoid. I was finally drawn in, however, by the Unspeakable One's proclamation that it had come to this planet in order to find someone, as someone who shared the name of my mother. No, this was no coincidence, and as I mindlessly reacted by informing the thing of my relation to its target, it was at this time I felt a grip tighter than I had felt at any time since my original visitor's arrival. What the source of this atmosphere was I could not know. Perhaps these three creatures being together had suddenly weighted themselves upon me. Maybe the King in Yellow's desire to find my mother had stricken me with fear when I considered what I had from her just the day before, or something else I could not imagine. All I could know at this time was that there was no one I could turn to any longer without the whisper of doubt voicing itself in my head. End of chapter.